Prologue. The hunger, there is a silence in the great northern forests, a quiet so deep it presses in on you, a physical weight in the frozen air. In the heart of the deep winter, the world is bleached of color and sound. It is reduced to the endless white of the snow, the pale gray of the sky, and the deep oppressive quiet. In this vast indifference, another kind of emptiness grows. Hunger, not the familiar pang of a missed meal, but a profound cellular starvation, a gnawing void that consumes thought and memory and hope. It is a hunger so complete that the world outside begins to fade, and the only reality is the echoing emptiness within. As the body wastes away, the mind begins to change. The laws of man, the bonds of family, the memory of love, they all feel like stories from a distant, warmer world. The only truth is the cold, and the only God is the hunger, a God that demands to be fed. And in this place of utter desperation, a question that civilization has long since forgotten how to ask begins to whisper on the wind. When the last of the food is gone, when there is nothing left to hunt and nothing left to eat, what do you do? When the hunger becomes so great that the person sleeping next to you through the long frozen night is no longer your friend, no longer your family, but is simply meat. What ancient spirit awakens in the forest when that final line is crossed? Chapter 1. The world that created the myth. The story of the Wendigo belongs to a specific place, a vast and ancient wilderness known as the Great North Woods. The boreal forest, a world-spanning belt of green that stretches across the northern edge of the continent. It is a primordial world of pine and spruce, of birch and tamarack, a land of 10,000 lakes, and 1,000,000 silent frozen rivers. It is a land of stark and severe beauty, but it is not a gentle place. It is not a landscape that nurtures or provides with ease. Its primary state is cold, a deep, penetrating cold that settles into the bones of the earth for more than half the year. Its silence is not peaceful, but watchful. The silence of a predator waiting. For millennia, this has been a forest that has resisted human domination. It is too cold, too dense, and its soil too thin for widespread agriculture. People have not lived in it so much as they have survived on its edges and in its shadow. It is a world you hunt in, a world you journey through, but it is not a world that you ever truly tame. For thousands of years, this immense forest has been the home of a great family of nations, the Algonquin-speaking peoples. From the Cree and Innu in the far north to the Ojibwe on the Great Lakes and the Mi'kmaq in the east, they are a diverse people, but they all share a deep ancestral connection to this land and a profound understanding of how to survive within it. Theirs was a life lived according to the rhythm of the seasons. They were semi-nomadic hunters and gatherers, moving with the animal herds and the ripening of berries. They understood the forest not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a living, breathing entity, a great provider that offered everything needed for life, but which demanded respect and careful attention in return. This understanding was at the heart of their world view. For them, the world was not a dead collection of resources. For human use, it was alive. Every animal, every tree, every lake, and every gust of wind possessed a spirit, a will, and a consciousness of its own. Humans were not masters of this world. They were simply one part of a vast interconnected family of other than human persons. To survive, you had to maintain a proper, balanced relationship with all of them. This was the fundamental law of the land. You showed respect. You made offerings. You took only what you needed, and you never ever gave into excessive greed. Because if you broke the law, if you insulted the spirits, or took more than your share, the spirits could punish you. And in the deep, unforgiving cold of the northern winter, to break the greatest law of all could awaken the most terrible spirit in the forest. But sometimes, despite all their knowledge, skill, and deep respect for the land, the winter would stretch on too long. The caribou would not return, the fish would not rise through the ice, and the food that had been carefully stored would slowly vanish. A family, sealed inside their snowbound lodge, would begin to feel the world shrinking. Hunger would become more than a discomfort. It would settle into the bones, dull the senses, and test the spirit. Days of want would pass into weeks. The cold outside would be matched only by the silence within. This was the moment of greatest danger, not only of the body, but of the mind. when every thought becomes weighed down by hunger, and the memory of shared rules and sacred values begins to fade, when isolation and suffering begin to blur the lines between what is unthinkable and what is possible. For the Algonquian peoples, there was one boundary that must never be crossed, one law more sacred than any other: the refusal to consume another person, no matter the cost. To break this taboo was to risk a profound unraveling of community, of spirit, and of the self. It was believed that such an act brought with it a deep corruption, a cold emptiness that could never be filled again. It was a call into the frozen silence, a call that summoned something dark from the woods, something ancient and forever hungry. When the great cold finally broke and the forest began to thaw, it was a time of relief for most, a return to life, but for a community that had lost members to the long dark, or for a lone survivor who stumbled back from a season of silence, the spring could bring a new and different kind of fear, a quiet lingering dread that settled with the morning mist. The questions would hang unspoken in the air. How did this one person survive when the others did not? Why do their eyes now hold such a strange and hollow emptiness? Why do they sit apart so silent? The community would watch, and they would wonder, and they would wonder, and they would fear what unthinkable choices were made in the depths of that long, cold winter. Because the deepest fear was not about what had already happened. It was about what could happen next. The belief was that a person who had crossed that sacred boundary was forever changed, that the unnatural act created an unnatural and unending hunger inside them. The physical starvation may have ended with the spring, but the spiritual starvation, once awakened, would never leave. The survivor was now marked, a vessel for a craving that could reawaken at any time. Chapter 2: What is the Wendigo? Authentic folklore, this lasting corruption, this spiritual hunger born from a broken taboo, was known by many names across the vast Algonquian world. To the Cray peoples of the subarctic plains and forests, it was the Wendigo. To their southern neighbors, the Ojibwe of the Great Lakes region, it was the Wendigo. Other nations knew it by other names, each a variation on a theme, but the meaning always carried the same chilling weight: an evil spirit, a monster, a cannibal. First and foremost, this entity was understood, not as a physical beast one might track and hunt, but as a powerful and disembodied spirit. It was the personification of winter itself, the embodiment of the cold, the emptiness, and the insatiable hunger that defined that season. It was said to travel on the gusting winter winds, a whispering malevolence that searched the frozen landscape for a weak, net soul to inhabit. This spirit could be caught almost like a sickness of the soul. A person who was isolated and starving was vulnerable, but so was a person who was greedy, who hoarded resources from their community. The spirit could invade a person through a dream, or be drawn to a heart that had already given in to selfishness. Its primary purpose was to find a human host, a physical vessel through which it could satisfy its own terrible cravings. Once the spirit took root inside a person, it would begin to consume them from within. The old stories say it would eat their soul and replace their human heart with a shard of ice. The person they once were was now gone, their body just a puppet, a walking corpse animated by a single, overwhelming desire that was not their own: the spirit's unending, unnatural hunger for human flesh. While the Wendigo was first and foremost a spirit, that spirit would horrifically transform the body of its human host. The person would begin to grow, stretching to a terrifying, gigantic height, towering over ordinary men. But this growth brought no strength. As the creature grew taller, it became more and more emaciated, its flesh seemingly consumed from within, leaving only a thin, translucent layer of deathly gray skin stretched tight over its bones. This paradoxical form was a symbol of its curse. Its immense height represented its immense hunger, but its skeletal body represented the fact that this hunger could never be satisfied. No matter how many victims it consumed, it could never be full, for the act of consumption only caused it to grow larger and therefore even hungrier. It was a walking, breathing portrait of an all-consuming, unending state of want. The details of its appearance, passed down in stories, are deeply unsettling. Its eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, were said to glow with a cold and an animalistic light. Its hands and feet were sometimes described as having long, jagged talons. And perhaps most disturbingly, many traditions described the Wendigo as being lipless. Its teeth, long and yellowed, forever exposed, as if, in its insatiable madness, it had chewed its own lips away. And sometimes a final tragic detail was included, a haunting echo of the person the monster once was. It might be a tattered piece of a familiar hunting shirt still clinging to its skeletal frame, or a specific lock of hair, a small, terrible reminder that this creature was not born a monster. It was made, forged in the desperate moments when a human being chose to break the most sacred law. The creature born from this possession was not merely a shambling giant. It was a supernaturally powerful hunter. It was said to be impossibly fast and strong-pulled, to run with the speed of the wind and endure the most punishing cold without feeling it. Some stories told of its ability to mimic human voices, to cry like a baby or call a person's name, luring its victims out from the safety of their lodges and into the darkness. All of its abilities served a single purpose: to find its next meal. Once transformed, the human consciousness was gone, replaced entirely by the spirit's all-consuming hunger. There was no reason left, no pity, no memory of love or kinship. It would hunt its own former friends and family without recognition, seeing them not as people, but as objects, as a means to temporarily quiet the gnawing emptiness that was its entire existence. But this is the heart of the curse and the greatest terror of the Wendigo. Its hunger is truly insatiable. The more it eats, the larger it grows, and the larger it grows, the more profound its starvation becomes. Every meal is a torment, providing no satisfaction, no relief, only a momentary pause before the void inside deepens and the craving returns, stronger than before. It is a paradox of gluttony and starvation, made flesh, because no amount of food from the outside world can ever fill the emptiness within. The Wendigo is trapped in a state of eternal, agonizing self-consumption. Its tattered lips are just the beginning. It is a being fundamentally at war with itself, a black hole of pure need that can never be filled, a spirit of hunger so profound that its ultimate fate is to devour itself, but not before it has consumed everything and everyone around it. The most profound transformation that occurred within a person taken by the Wendigo spirit was not visible from the outside. The law from many different Algonquian nations agrees on one central metaphysical point. The spirit would consume the person's human heart, and in its place a lump of jagged ice would grow. This heart of jagged ice would grow. This heart of ice was both the source of the creature's power and the engine of its curse. It was what made the Wendigo immune to the bitterest cold of the northern winter. But more importantly, it was a powerful metaphor for the complete and total loss of human warmth, of empathy, of compassion, of kinship and love. The Wendigo was a creature that could no longer feel anything but the cold, hollow ache of its own emptiness. This metaphysical weakness was also the key to the creature's destruction. Because it was a supernatural being, a Wendigo could often not be killed by ordinary means. Arrows or even bullets were said to be useless against it unless one was a powerful shaman. The only way to truly kill the Wendigo, to ensure it would not rise again, was to destroy its frozen heart. According to the law, after a Wendigo had been killed, its body had to be carefully dismembered. The lump of ice had to be carved from its chest and then painstakingly melted in the flames of a sacred fire until not a single shard remained. Only then would the physical vessel of its corruption, destroyed, would the evil spirit finally be released from the world, its icy grip broken at last. But the story of the Wendigo was never just about literal starvation or the taboo of eating human flesh. It was a powerful and essential cultural metaphor for a much broader human failing greed, a person who hoarded food while others went hungry, a leader who put their own power above the good of the people, a traitor who cheated his partners. All of these individuals were said to be acting like a Wendigo. In a society that depended entirely on mutual support, cooperation, and the sharing of resources to survive, individual selfishness was not just a personal flaw. It was a mortal threat to the entire community. The Wendigo was the ultimate cautionary tale, a terrifying supernatural embodiment of what happens when a person forgets their sacred obligations to their kin and chooses to serve only their own bottomless appetite. And it is here that the myth finds its most chilling and timeless relevance. The Wendigo is more than an ancient forest spirit. It is a symbol of insatiable consumption, the spiritual disease of wanting more and more and more far beyond what is needed for survival. A hunger for power, for wealth, for resources that eventually consumes the host from the inside out. It is a story that warns that the greatest monsters are often born not from external demons, but from the frozen empty spaces within our own desires. Chapter 3: The Shaman's War Against the Spirit. In a world that was understood to be alive with powerful spirits, both helpful and hostile, every community needed a specialist, an expert who could navigate the complex and often dangerous landscape of the spirit world. This crucial figure, a person of immense power, training, and respect, was the shaman. The shaman was far more than just a medicine man. They were the community's psychologist, its prophet, and its diplomat to the spirit world. They healed the sick by finding the spiritual cause of their illness. They interpreted dreams to divine the future, and they negotiated with the spirits of the game animals to ensure a successful hunt. Their most important job was to maintain the delicate balance between the human world and the world of the spirits. Their power came from an extraordinary ability cultivated over years of disciplined training, the power to enter a deep trance state and send their own spirit out from their body. On these soul flights, they could travel through the spirit world, meet with the great powers of the cosmos, bargain with malevolent entities, and retrieve the lost souls of the sick. And this ability made them the only people who could truly fight a Wendigo, because the Wendigo was first and foremost a spiritual threat. It could not be defeated by physical weapons. It had to be confronted on its own terms on the spiritual plane. Only a P and 4D, only a shaman, a warrior who could walk in both worlds, had the training and the power to face the corrupting spirit of the Wendigo directly and stand a chance of winning. The first battle against the Wendigo often took place not in the physical world, but in the landscape of the mind. For many Algonquian cultures, dreams were not meaningless fantasies. They were a vital bridge to the spirit world, a space where humans could receive guidance, warnings, and prophecies. A powerful or recurring dream was therefore taken with the utmost seriousness. If a person in the community began to be plagued by certain kinds of nightmares, dreaming of being lost in an endless winter storm, dreaming of a tall skeletal figure moving through the trees, or most terrifyingly, dreaming of the act of consuming human flesh, this was a profound spiritual alarm bell. It was believed to be a sign that the Wendigo spirit had taken notice of that person and was attempting to establish a beachhead in their soul. The afflicted person would seek out the shaman for a diagnosis. They would recount the details of the dream, and the shaman would use their own powers of divination to interpret its meaning. By entering a trance, the shaman could determine the nature of the spirit that had sent the dream and gauge the severity of its influence on the person's soul. This was a critical moment. If the fire fell from heaven determined that it was indeed the Wendigo spirit trying to begin a possession, the community would mobilize. A spiritual war had to be waged immediately to drive the entity out before it could fully take root, before the heart turned to ice and the hunger became all-consuming. The prophetic dream was the first skirmish in the battle for a human soul. When a community faced a grave, spiritual threat, like a potential Wendigo, a shaman might perform one of the most powerful and dramatic ceremonies known among the Algonquian peoples, the rite of the shaking tent. A special lodge was constructed for this purpose. A small, narrow barrel-shaped structure, built to be a temporary vessel for immense spiritual power. A doorway between the prage. The story stops. A doorway between the worlds. The shaman would crawl inside, often after being securely bound with ropes by members of the community to prove that the events to come were not the result of any physical trickery. The community would then gather in the darkness outside the lodge, waiting in hushed anticipation for the ceremony to begin. They would not see what happened inside the tent, but they would hear it. From within the darkness, the shaman would begin to chant, calling out to their spirit helpers. Soon, those gathered outside would hear strange sounds coming from the lodge, animal cries, whispers, and then distinct voices, each with its own personality and tone. These were the voices of the spirits arriving from the other world. As they arrived, the entire lodge would begin to shake and sway violently, as if caught in a powerful storm, straining against the combined energy of the entities now packed inside. This was a direct consultation with the spirit world. Members of the community could ask questions of the spirits, and the spirits would answer, their voices emanating from the shaking tent. In the case of a suspected Wendigo possession, this was the ultimate diagnostic tool. The shaman would ask their spirit guides to confirm the presence of the evil spirit, to gauge its strength, and to provide the sacred knowledge needed to drive it out. It was a way to get a clear answer in a time of overwhelming fear. If the shaman's diagnosis confirmed that the Wendigo spirit was taking hold, but before the person had committed any acts of violence, there was still a chance to save them. The community would observe the afflicted person closely. They would become sullen, withdrawn, and antisocial. They would refuse to eat any normal food, and they would often complain of a deep, unshakable chill, a physical manifestation of the ice that was beginning to form in their heart. This was the Wendigo sickness, and it was a race against time. The community knew that if the spirit was not driven out, it would eventually consume the person's humanity entirely. The quiet, withdrawn patient would transform into a violent and unrecognizable monster. A desperate cure had to be attempted. The most widely documented treatment for this early stage is shocking to modern sensibilities. The shaman, sometimes with the help of the family, would attempt to force-feed the afflicted person, not with meat or broth, but with hot, rendered animal fat. Spoonful after spoonful of hot grease or tallow was administered, sometimes by forcing a stick of hardened fat down the person's throat. The logic behind this seemingly bizarre cure was deeply spiritual. The Wendigo was a being of pure, deathly cold. Its spirit and heart were made of ice. Therefore, the only way to fight it from the inside was with heat and fat, the most concentrated sources of energy and warmth. The hope was that the hot grease would literally melt the frozen heart, forcing the person to vomit out the evil spirit and breaking its icy grip on their soul. But sometimes the cure would fail, or a person would only be discovered after they had already succumbed to the hunger and harmed others. In these tragic cases, the person was considered lost forever, their human soul completely devoured by the inhabiting spirit. They were no longer a sick relative to be cured. They were a Wendigo, a permanent threat to every living thing around them. Faced with this reality, the community, often led by the shaman, had to perform a terrible and final duty. The monster had to be destroyed. This was not an act of vengeance, but of community protection. The Wendigo would be ritually executed, sometimes with a silver bullet or by beheading, but always with the goal of subduing the physical body, so that the true spiritual work could begin. Simply killing the physical form was not enough. The body was still a vessel for the corrupting spirit, and had to be utterly destroyed to prevent the Wendigo from rising again or from its spirit leaping into a new host. The body would be dismembered, and the icy heart would be carefully carved from its chest. These parts were then placed on a massive funeral pyre. The fire had to be kept burning, sometimes for days, until every last piece of the body, and especially the heart of ice, was completely rendered into ash. Only then, through this final fiery rite of purification, could the community be certain that the spirit was banished, and that they were finally safe from the unnatural hunger that wall kept in the winter winds, music into this ancient world of spirits and shamans. A new kind of man began to. Chapter 4. The Jesuit demonologists arrive in the 17th century. They came from across the great ocean, from the sophisticated cities of France. They were men of intense faith and immense learning. Members of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, known as the Black Robes by the indigenous peoples. They voluntarily left the world they knew to venture into what they considered a savage, godless wilderness. Their mission was singular and absolute: to bring the light of the Christian God to the native peoples of North America. They saw the indigenous population as living in a state of spiritual darkness, their lives and beliefs governed not by God but by the devil and his legions of demons. These missionaries were prepared to endure unimaginable hardship, starvation, disease, and even martyrdom, all for the sake of saving souls. As these highly educated Europeans lived among the Algonquian tribes, they began to meticulously document the customs, languages, and beliefs they encountered. They were some of the first ethnographers of the New World, but they recorded what they saw not with the open mind of an anthropologist, but with the judgmental eye of a theologian. They were mapping the kingdom of Satan. And it is in their detailed journals, their relations sent back to France, that we find the very first written accounts of the terrifying spirit their new flock so deeply feared, the Wendigo. When the Jesuits listened to the horrifying stories of a cannibalistic spirit that could possess a person and drive them to madness, they did not dismiss them as mere superstition. They believed they were hearing eyewitness testimony of a genuine supernatural evil at work, but they interpreted this evil through the only framework they knew, their own deeply held Catholic theology. To the only, the Wendigo was not a nature spirit born of winter and starvation. It was quite simply a demon, a fallen angel, a servant of Satan, preying upon the souls of a people who did not have the protection of the true faith. The shaman's shaking tent ceremony was not a consultation with spirit guides, but a form of witchcraft, and the spirit itself was a devil that had claimed the northern woods as its personal dominion. And if the Wendigo was a demon, then the solution was not a shaman's rattle or a ritual fire. The solution was the power of Christ. The Jesuits wrote in their journals of confronting the Wendigo spirit, of brandishing the cross against it, and of using the rite of exorcism to cast the demon out of its victims. They saw themselves as soldiers in a spiritual war, fighting a literal devil for the future of the continent, and their journals provide a fascinating, if biased, record of this profound clash of faiths. The Jesuit relations, the collected journals sent back to Europe, are filled with this struggle, a constant attempt to fit the square peg of Algonquian cosmology into the round hole of Christian demonology. The priests were brilliant, dedicated men, but they were ultimately men of their time, limited by the absolute certainty of their own faith. They could listen to the stories, they could record the words, but they could not truly comprehend the worldview behind them. The idea of a world alive with spirits that were not angels or demons, the idea of a monster born not from inherent evil, but from desperation and a violation of the natural order. These were concepts for which their theology had no category. And so the first written records of the Wendigo are a fascinating but flawed lens. They preserve invaluable details about the belief, but they are always colored by the profound cultural and spiritual misunderstanding of the men recording them. I give us the story, but they miss the meaning. To them, the Wendigo was simply another monster in a world full of devils. They failed to see it for what it was to the people who truly believed in it. A story about the fragility of the human mind and a powerful sacred warning about the darkness that sleeps within the human heart. Our story now moves from the realm of Chapter 5, the true crime case of Swift Runner, myth and second-hand accounts, to a specific, documented and deeply disturbing case. It is the late 1870s in the vast plains and forests of what is now Alberta, Canada, and our focus is a man from the creation named Kakisi Kuchin, known to the authorities and traders simply as Swift Runner. He was not an outcast, nor a man feared by his community. By all accounts, Swift Runner was a well-known and highly respected figure. He was tall and powerfully built, known for his skill as a hunter and trapper, and for his calm and reliable disposition. He was a man who moved confidently between two worlds, the traditional world of his own people and the new world of the European settlers, traders, and lawmen. His skills made him particularly valuable to the authorities of the expanding Canadian territory. He worked as a trusted guide for both the Hudson's Bay Company and the newly formed Northwest Mounted Police, leading their patrols through the unforgiving wilderness that he knew so intimately. He was seen by the settlers as a model of successful cooperation, a reliable and peaceable man. But this was a time of catastrophic change for the Kia. The great buffalo herds, the lifeblood of their entire culture, had been hunted to near extinction by settlers and hide hunters. This ecological disaster was compounded by Canadian government policies designed to force nomadic peoples onto newly established reservations, often by withholding food aid. It was an era of unprecedented famine, disease, and social collapse, a world turned upside down by colonial expansion. It was in the midst of this desperation that Swift Runner prepared for his trip in the autumn of 1878, The journey was no longer a routine trapping expedition. It was a profound gamble, an attempt to find sustenance for his family in the deep wilderness, far away from the famine-stricken plains. He was accompanied by his wife, his 6 children, his mother-in-law, and his brother. Together, the family group journeyed deep into the northern forest, seeking a refuge that they hoped still held the game that had vanished from their homeland. As the first snows began to fall, they disappeared from the outside world, leaving a collapsing society behind them to face the deep winter alone. The snows of 1878 fell hard and deep, blanketing the forest in a profound and isolating silence. For Swift Runner and his family, their small winter camp became their entire world, a tiny island of human life in a vast frozen ocean of trees. Weeks turned into months, and the winter grew colder, darker, more severe. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest trading post, from the nearest mission, from any other living soul. In that remote camp, there was no one to witness their struggle if the hunt failed, no one to help if sickness took hold. The only authority was the unforgiving law of the deep winter, and the only witness was the silent, watching forest. Finally, the great cold broke. The ice on the rivers began to crack, and the geese returned to the north. Throughout the territory, other trappers and hunters began to make their way back to the settlements and trading posts to sell their furs. But as the weeks of spring wore on, Swift Runner and his large family did not appear. At first, it was not unusual, but as more time passed, a quiet concern began to grow among the traders and the police. It was unlike such an experienced man to be this late. Then, late in the spring of 1879, he was seen. Swift Runner stumbled alone out of the vast wilderness and into the Catholic mission near the town of St. Albert. He was a shadow of the man who had left the previous autumn, not physically, for his body seemed strong enough, but his eyes were wild, haunted. The confident gaze of the trusted guide was gone, replaced by a deep and terrible trauma. When the priests asked him where his family was, he broke down. He told them a harrowing and tragic story. The winter had been brutal, he said. The game had vanished, and starvation had set in. One by one, he claimed his wife, his children, his mother-in-law, and his brother had all succumbed to sickness and hunger, leaving him as the sole heartbroken survivor of a terrible tragedy. At first, the priests at the mission offered Swift Runner nothing but sympathy and comfort. His story was a horrific one, but it was not unbelievable. The northern winters were notoriously cruel and tragic tales of entire families perishing from starvation, or unfortunately not unheard of. They provided him with food and shelter and listened to his tale of loss. But as the days passed, the men who tended to him, the priests, and eventually the officers of the Northwest Mounted Police, who took his statement, began to notice a strange and unsettling discrepancy. For a man who claimed to have been on the brink of death from starvation for months, Swift Runner seemed remarkably healthy. His body was not emaciated. He was strong, too strong. This was the one detail that did not fit the story. True survivors of such an ordeal were typically skeletal, weak, clinging to life by a thread. Swift Runner's physical condition was a silent accusation that his story was at best incomplete and at worst a terrible lie. The haunted look in his eyes spoke of tree armor, but his well-fed body spoke of something else entirely. The authorities' suspicions grew when they began to speak with other prey hunters and trappers who were returning from their own winter camps. They all told the same story. The winter had been cold, but it had not been cold, but it had not been unusually severe. The game had not vanished. There was no widespread famine in the region. There was simply no reason that a hunter as skilled and experienced as Swift Runner should have lost his entire family to starvation. Then came the final chilling piece of testimony. Swift Runner's mother-in-law had spoken to friends before departing, expressing a deep fear of her son-in-law and a premonition that something terrible would happen. This, combined with the conflicting reports and Swift Runner's inexplicably healthy appearance, was enough. The Northwest Mounted Police realized they had to investigate further. They decided to form a patrol, and they asked Swift Runner to lead them back to his winter camp, back to the scene of the tragedy. Reluctantly, Swift Runner agreed to lead the police back to his wintering ground. The journey was long and tense. The confident guide who had once expertly led patrols through the same wilderness was gone. In his place was a sullen, quiet man who seemed to be walking toward his own doom. A man who would frequently stop and claim to have forgotten the way, only to be prodded onwards by the increasingly suspicious officers. When they finally arrived at the location of the camp, the scene was immediately and profoundly unsettling. It was eerily quiet. They found a makeshift lodge and a small camp, but for a place where 8 people had supposedly perished, there was one thing missing: graves. There was no sign that anyone had been given any kind of burial. As the officers began to search the area around the camp, a grim picture began to emerge. They found human bone scattered in the snow, picked clean. Many had been cracked open, a telltale sign that someone had been trying to get at the marrow inside. The officers were experienced men of the wilderness, and they knew these were not the bones of any animal they had ever hunted. Inside the small lodge, the true horror was revealed. The officers found more human remains, a cooking pot that still held rendered human fat, and a small moccasin belonging to Swift Runner's youngest child. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and more gruesome than they could have possibly imagined. Swift Runner's story of a tragic winter of starvation had been a terrible lie. This was not a scene of deprivation. The officers found the camp's food cache, which still contained dried meat and other supplies. This was a scene of slaughter, a place where one man had systematically hunted and consumed his own family. The mystery of the Winter of Silence had been solved, and the authorities now had their killer. With the discovery of the gruesome evidence at the campsite, Swift Runner was immediately arrested and charged with the murder of his entire family and the act of cannibalism. He offered no resistance. The wild, traumatized act he had put on at the mission was gone, replaced by a strange and unsettling calm, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was transported under the guard to Fort Saskatchewan to await what would become a landmark trial. The trial of Swift Runner was one of the first instances of Canadian law being formally imposed in these remote Western territories. It represented a profound clash of worlds. A British-style court, with its robed judge, its jury of white settlers, and its rigid rules of evidence, was about to sit in judgment on a case that was born from the deepest and most ancient laws of the Northern Forest. When confronted with the undeniable evidence Gaith read from his camp, Swift Runner did not deny his actions. To the shock of the court, he confessed to everything in meticulous and chilling detail, but his explanation for why he did it was something the court was entirely unprepared to hear. He did not plead insanity, at least not in a way the legal system could understand. He claimed that he was not responsible, that he had been possessed. He told the court that a Wendigo spirit had come to him in the depths of that winter, that it had entered his body, put ice in his heart, and filled him with an agonizing and irresistible hunger. He described with a disturbing calmness how the spirit, using his body as a vessel, had then turned on his family. He was not a murderer, he insisted. He was simply the final victim of a monster, the only one whose body had survived the ordeal. The Canadian court, of course, had no legal category for demonic possession or an evil spirit from the forest. To the judge and jury, his confession was simply an admission of guilt to a series of horrific but entirely human crimes. But for the Cree people who followed the trial, his words meant something else entirely. They were hearing a terrifyingly real and first-hand account of a man who had truly lost the battle for his soul. Unsurprisingly, the Canadian court found Swift Runner guilty. He was sentenced to be publicly hanged at Fort Saskatchewan. In the weeks leading up to his execution, he remained eerily calm, continuing to insist that he was not a murderer. He maintained that the Wendigo spirit was the true criminal, and that his death would finally set him free from its torment. Instead, he made traditional requests, asking for a final feast to be shared with his people. He wanted them to witness his death, not to see a man punished, but to be assured that the monster that had destroyed his family was finally being put to an end. On the cold morning of December 20th, 1879, a crowd gathered to witness the execution. For the Canadian government, this was a necessary display of their authority, a demonstration that the rule of law had come to the wilderness and that murder would be met with swift colonial justice. But for the Cree observers who stood in the crowd, it was something else entirely. a public ritualistic execution of a malevolent spirit. According to the historical accounts of the hanging, Swiftrunner remained calm until the very end. But as the hangman tried to place the traditional black hood over his head, something changed. He began to resist, fighting back against the gods with a surprising and ferocious strength. A terrible guttural and inhuman scream was said to have ripped from his throat, a sound that chilled the blood of everyone present. To the Canadian authorities, it was simply the final desperate struggle of a condemned killer. But the Creole witnesses saw something else in that moment. They did not see Swiftrunner, the respected guide they had once known. In his final furious rage, they saw the cornered and defiant spirit that had consumed him, the Wendigo itself, roaring its hatred for the world right up until the very end. As more cases like Swiftrunners came to Chapter 6, Wendigo Psychosis, a sickness of the mind, the attention of the authorities, and as the world moved into the more scientific age of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a new explanation for the phenomenon began to emerge. Western doctors and the first generation of anthropologists were not satisfied with the supernatural explanation of the shamans, nor the simple criminal verdict of the courts. They sought a rational cause for these terrible events. They proposed that the Wendigo was not an external spirit that possessed a person, but an internal one, a sickness of the mind. They argued that the immense psychological pressure of prolonged starvation, combined with extreme cold and profound social isolation, could trigger a severe and terrifying mental breakdown, a form of psychosis. In this view, the overwhelming craving for human flesh was a delusion, a symptom of the psychosis, and the belief in a monster called the Wendigo was a culturally specific framework that gave the afflicted person a way to understand their own horrifying and unthinkable impulses. It was easier to believe you had been possessed by a monster than to accept that your own mind had produced such a terrible desire. The monster was real, the new theory argued, but it lived inside the human brain. Following these initial psychological theories, a new generation of researchers went out into the field in the early 20th century to formally study the Wendigo. Anthropologists and folklorists traveled to remote Algonquian communities, armed with notebooks and wax cylinder recorders. They interviewed elders, collected stories, and meticulously documented every variation of the belief they could find. They were determined to create a complete scientific record of what they considered to be a dying superstition. They analyzed the myth in the same way a biologist might dissect a new species of animal. They broke it down into its component parts, its common folkloric motifs, its supposed social functions, its predictable psychological triggers. The terrifying living spirit of the northern forest was being transformed into academic data, an object to be classified and filed away in a university archive. This academic gaze, while preserving an invaluable record of the folklore, also had the effect of desacralizing the myth. It took the Wendigo out of its natural environment of fear, belief, and the deep winter snows and placed it under the sterile fluorescent lights of the laboratory and the lecture hall. The lecture hall. The spirit was no longer a living threat to be fought by a shaman. It was becoming a specimen, an interesting footnote in the study of so-called primitive cultures. This scientific effort to explain the phenomenon resulted in a new and influential medical classification, Wendigo psychosis. For much of the 20th century, it was considered a textbook example of what anthropologists and psychiatrists call a culture-bound syndrome. A culture-bound syndrome is a mental illness whose specific symptoms are shaped by the beliefs and stories of a particular culture. The underlying psychological distress, such as severe depression, trauma, or anxiety, might be universal, but the form it takes is unique. In one culture, a person might believe they are possessed by a demon. In another, they might believe they are turning into a wolf. And in the northern forests of North America, they might believe they are becoming a Wendigo. The theory of Wendigo psychosis provided a neat, rational, and complete explanation that satisfied the scientific mind. The spirit was a delusion, the transformation a symptom, and the terrible acts of cannibalism were the tragic outcome of a recognizable, if culturally unique, mental illness. For the academic world, the mystery was solved. The Wendigo was not a spirit to be feared. It was a psychosis to be studied, catalogued, and understood. The theory of Wendigo psychosis was a tidy explanation, one that fit perfectly into the rational scientific worldview of the 20th century. It allowed observers to understand the phenomenon without having to entertain the possibility that spirits or monsters were real. For many, the case was now closed. But for others, including many of the Algonquian people themselves, this explanation felt incomplete. Pressure, but not the why it broke, in this specific terrifying way. Could not a malevolent spirit be the cause of the mental sickness? Was it not possible that the psychological trauma of starvation was simply the cracked door through which the ancient spirit of the forest could force its way in? And so the question remains, suspended between two worlds. Was the Wendigo a sickness of the mind that a culture interpreted as a spirit? Or was it a spirit that caused a sickness of the mind? Are they two different ways of describing the same terrible reality? The academic world had provided its neat answer, but as the belief began to fade from real life and start a new journey into the world of fiction, its true nature would become more mysterious and more malleable than ever before. Chapter 7. How Folklore Becomes Fiction. As the 20th century progressed, the world that had created the Wendigo began to change. Irrevocably, the traditional semi-nomadic ways of life for many Algonquian peoples were disrupted, and the deep, desperate isolation of the winter hunt became less and less common. With these immense social changes, the very real threat of starvation that had always fueled the belief began to recede, and the Wendigo, as a genuine cultural fear, started to fade into memory. But while the spirit was vanishing from the real world, it was beginning a strange new life on the written page. The stories that had been meticulously collected by the Jesuits and the anthropologists were now sitting quietly in university libraries and archives, waiting to be discovered by a new kind of shaman. Not a healer or a prophet, but a writer of fiction. These authors were not interested in the complex cultural warnings about greed or the specific spiritual meaning of the creature. They were searching for a good monster, a new and terrifying thing in the woods to populate their tales of supernatural and cosmic horror. In the Pogo, they found the perfect raw material. A name that dripped with ancient menace and a story connected to cannibalism and madness. They took the name and a few of the creature's characteristics, but they left most of its cultural soul behind. The most important and influential story to ever shape the modern image of the Wendigo was written in 1910 by the English master of weird fiction, Algernon Blackwood. His novella, simply titled The Wendigo, took the raw ingredients he had discovered in old anthropological accounts, a hunting party deep in the Canadian wilderness, a mysterious terror haunting the woods, and a native guide who knows more than he is willing to say, and he spun them into a masterpiece of psychological horror. Blackwood's Wendigo, however, was a profound departure from the original folklore. It was not a spirit of cannibalism born from a human transgression. It was something far stranger. An immense elemental being of the air, a creature that lived in the upper atmosphere and would sometimes descend to snatch a victim from their campsite, dragging them screaming on a terrifying high-speed journey through the treetops and into the sky. The victim of Blackwood's creature did not develop a craving for human flesh. Instead, their feet were burned to stumps from the impossible speed of their flight, and their mind was shattered by a brief glimpse into a vast cosmic and utterly indifferent reality. With this story, the horror of the Wendigo was changed. It was no longer a moral horror about the darkness within the human heart, but a modern cosmic horror about humanity's utter and insignificance in the face of an ancient unknowable universe. This powerful literary reinvention would influence almost every Wendigo story that came after. Blackwood's influential story was read and admired by other authors in the burgeoning genre of weird fiction, most notably the circle of writers surrounding the horror master H.P. Lovecraft. They were fascinated by the idea of an ancient pre-human entity haunting the North American continent, and they saw its potential as a character in their own growing mythology. Lovecraft's friend and correspondent, August Derleth, later formally adopted Blackwood's version of the Wendigo into the shared universe of the Cthulhu mythos. He gave it a new name, Ethqua, the Wind Walker, and classified it as a great old one, a cosmic being of immense power. Now the Wendigo was no longer an Algonquian spirit born of starvation. It was a member of a fictional pantheon of alien gods. Its transformation from authentic folklore to literary monster was nearly complete. By the mid century, the Wendigo's journey into fiction was done. It had been successfully severed from its specific cultural roots and its complex moral warnings. The name itself had become a powerful piece of horror vocabulary, a reliable trope for a scary thing in the woods. It was a monstrous boogeyman that authors could now use to frighten campers and protagonists, a generic name for any terrifying thing that lurked just beyond the fragile circle of the firelight. Chapter 8: The Pop Culture Creature, the Antlered Skull. As the 20th century moved on, the Wendigo made the inevitable leap from the written page to the flickering screen. It began to appear as a villain in horror comics, in anthology television series, and in a host of low-budget horror movies. It had become a reliable public domain monster, perfect for terrorizing any group of unsuspecting campers or lost travelers who wandered too far into the Canadian or American wilderness. In many of these early on-screen appearances, the Wendigo was treated much as it was in Algernon Blackwood's original story. It was an unseen or barely glimpsed force, a presence felt more than seen. Filmmakers, often constrained by limited budgets, would use menacing shadows, strange sounds, and frantic point-of-view shots to create a sense of dread, leaving the creature's true form to the viewer's imagination. The Wendigo's profile was raised significantly when it was featured as the ancient evil entity, animating the cursed ground in Stephen King's massively popular novel Pet Sematary and its subsequent film adaptations. Here the Wendigo was not a creature one fought directly. It was a source of spiritual poison, a genius low that corrupted the land and drove people to madness and terrible acts. This introduced the name and the core concept to millions, cementing its place in the pantheon of modern horror. In the late 20th and early 21st century, a new and very specific image of the Wendigo began to appear in popular culture, an image that has almost no basis in the original Algonquian folklore. This was the depiction of the Wendigo as a humanoid monster with the skull of a deer or an elk for a head, often crowned with a massive rack of antlers. This striking design, fusing a human-like body with the symbol of a wild forest animal, seems to have been popularized by independent horror films and cemented by a new generation of artists on the internet. The bony-horned visage was visually terrifying, instantly memorable, and had a kind of pagan old woods feel to it that creators found irresistible. This new antler look was so visually effective that it quickly became the default appearance for the creature in nearly every medium. It began appearing in popular television shows, comic books, and most significantly in video games, where its unique and terrifying silhouette made for a memorable enemy design. The deer skull Wendigo was no longer just one interpretation. It was becoming the definitive one, and with that, the creature's transformation as nearly complete. The authentic folkloric image of the Wendigo, a monstrous but recognizably human-like giant, its horror rooted in its loss of humanity. Human-like giant, its horror rooted in its loss of humanity, was almost entirely replaced in the popular imagination by this new, visually spectacular beast, a monster that was more animal than man. Perhaps no single piece of modern media cemented the Wendigo in the popular consciousness more than the hit 2015 survival horror game, Until Dawn. The game's premise was classic horror. A group of teenagers are stranded in a remote lodge on a snow-covered mountain with a dark history, forced to survive the night while being hunted by mysterious creatures. The game's creators, however, had done their research. They skillfully wove the authentic core of the Wendigo myth into their story. The mountain itself was cursed, and the monsters hunting the players were former miners who had been trapped in a cave in decades before. To survive, they had resorted to cannibalism, and in doing so, the ancient spirit of the mountain possessed them, transforming them into Wendigos. But the design of the creature in the game was entirely modern. This was not the lipless giant of folklore, nor was it the antler beast of internet art. The Until Dawn Wendigo was a fast, shrieking, blind creature that moved with an insect-like speed, a pale, hairless humanoid perfectly engineered for the jump scares and terrifying chase sequences of the video game format. For millions of gamers around the world, this was their definitive introduction to the Wendigo. The game was a massive success, and its brilliant blending of the authentic mythological cores The Curse of Cannibalism, with a terrifying and completely new visual design, created the most popular and widely known version of the monster for a whole new generation. And so, the Wendigo's long journey from a culturally specific spirit to a global pop culture monster was complete. It had been reinterpreted by missionaries, catalogued by anthropologists, reinvented by horror authors, and completely redesigned by filmmakers, artists, and game developers. Each step took it further and further from its source. In this long game of cultural translation, a great deal of the original meaning was left behind. The authentic Wendigo was a complex story about the human condition, a cautionary tale about our relationship with the natural world, the spiritual danger of greed, and the fragility of the human mind under the immense pressure of survival. It was a spirit that you became. The modern Wendigo, in most of its popular forms, is something much simpler. It is a physical monster to be fought and killed. It is a creature you encounter, not a state you fall into. The profound, tragic story of a human being losing their soul to an all-consuming hunger has been largely replaced by a generic, if visually spectacular movie monster, stripped of its cultural context and much of its original terrifying soul. Chapter 9: The Enduring Metaphor. The story of the Wendigo began with a simple and brutal reality: the physical hunger for food in a world of scarcity. For the people of the Great North Woods, this was a real and ever-present danger. But for most of us today, that specific fear has faded. So why does the story of this spirit still resonate so deeply? Why does it refuse to disappear? Perhaps it is because the nature of hunger has changed, but the feeling of emptiness has not. The myth of the Wendigo serves as a powerful and uncomfortable mirror. It warns that any hunger, when it becomes insatiable, can become monstrous. Whether it is a hunger for food in a time of scarcity, or a hunger for wealth, for power, or for the endless stream of information and validation in a time of abundance, the Wendigo is at its heart a story about the danger of a consumity on that never leads to satisfaction. It is a warning that a society, just like a person, that consumes without thought for balance or consequence, can develop a heart of ice, losing its warmth, its empathy, and its connection to the world around it. The spirit of the Wendigo, it seems, has not vanished. It has simply found a new and much larger forest to haunt. For the people of the northern forests, the line between humanity and monstrosity was clearly defined. It was the sacred taboo, the refusal to consume another for one's own survival. To cross that line was to lose your soul, to become a vessel for an unnatural hunger. It was a sickness of the spirit, a form of psychosis born from seeing the world not as a community of relatives, but as a collection of resources to be devoured. This concept of a mind plague, a psychosis of cannibalistic consumption, has been given a modern name by Indigenous thinkers and activists: Wito. They use the term to describe not a monster in the woods, but the deep spiritual sickness of colonial expansion itself, the rapacious hunger for land, for resources, for profit that consumes entire cultures and ecosystems without ever being satisfied. In this view, the real Wendigo was not Swift Runner, a man broken by a desperate and collapsing world. The real Wendigo was the insatiable hunger of the colonial machine that had destroyed his world, a culture that in its endless pursuit of more consumed the lives and lands of others, blind to the devastation it left in its wake. The story of the Wendigo, then, is not just an ancient myth. It is an eerily prescient diagnosis of a modern madness. And it leaves us with a final chilling question: what happens when an entire society, not just a single individual, crosses that sucked line? What happens when the Wendigo psychosis becomes the operating system of the world? Perhaps we have been looking at the story of the Wendigo backwards all this time. Perhaps it was never just a cautionary tale for the people who lived in the forest, but a prophecy about the world that was coming, a world that would be consumed by a hunger far greater than any individual could ever know. The old story said that the Wendigo was born when greed replaced community, and the natural world became a thing to be devoured. In that sense, the spirit never left the forest. It just found new and far more powerful hosts. Its hunger grew from a single family in a winter camp to entire peoples and entire continents. The true horror of the Wendigo myth is not that a monster with a heart of ice once haunted the woods. The true horror is the possibility that the world it warned against is the one we now call civilization. The story is not just an echo from the past. It is a diagnosis for a fever that is still spreading. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the cold, silent forests of the North and for listening to the story of the Wendigo. My mission is to continue exploring these complex and often overlooked stories from our past. If you'd like to be a part of this journey and not miss the next story, I would be honored if you would subscribe to the channel. As always, thank you for your time and attention.